It is true that this form of belief has assumed the moral leadership of the nation at certain crucial times. In one of its forms, transcendentalism set much of the intellectual tone of the 19th century. But it has rarely been the religion of the mass of Americans. One reason enlightened religion had such unchallenged sway in the late 18th century was that the other characteristic form of American religion, evangelicalism, was at its lowest ebb in just that period. Yet it came roaring back in the early 19th century, and has been adhered to by most Americans in succeeding ages. Evangelical religion. Enlightened religion professes a belief in the laws of nature and of nature's God. It holds that reason is the tool for understanding those laws, and that humane conduct is what those laws teach. Evangelicals, by contrast, emphasize an experiential relationship with Jesus as their Savior, along with biblical inerrancy and a mission to save others. Theirs is the religion of that characteristic American institution, the revival. The emphasis of enlightened religion is on the head. The emphasis of evangelicals is on the heart. These form the two poles of American religion in the dominant Protestant culture. The intellectual and the experiential forms of religion tug against each other, though they are not mutually exclusive. That's why I refer to them as two poles of religious attraction, not as two separate religions. It is true, of course, that America is a land of many religious traditions, not just two. But the two emphases I single out have had the greatest impact on the general religious ethos. They are not separate churches, but strong tendencies in many churches. The two poles are not formal bodies of doctrine, they are two force fields, each with its own tendency and emphasis. This is empirically observable in studies of different epochs in our history. Over and over we find historians identifying a conflict between these two strands, the enlightened and the evangelical. At different times they are identified by different terms: liturgical versus pietist, ecclesial versus revivalist, high church versus low church, elite versus populist, rational versus emotional, studied versus spontaneous, modernist versus fundamentalist, immanent versus apocalyptical, and so on. It is tempting but risky to think of the two strands politically as liberal versus conservative. In fact, some of the early proponents of enlightenment, like the Reverend Samuel Johnson, were politically conservative. In the Civil War, an evangelical like John Brown was radical, and the elite class of the South was reactionary. In our time, evangelicals have been radical enough to commit civil disobedience over abortion. It is too simple, and will uselessly heat discussion, to think of this as a permanent fight between liberals and conservatives. People have at various times expressed the antagonism of these two forces. In 1853, a prominent minister could complain of an impression somewhat general that an intellectual clergyman is deficient in piety, and that an eminently pious minister is deficient in intellect. Sidney Alstrom described the same phenomenon a century later. Americans have in effect been given the hard choice between being intelligent according to the standards prevailing in their intellectual centers, and being religious according to the standards prevailing in their denominations. Sidney Mead thought the two forces incompatible. I have concluded that the two stand in a relation of mutual antagonism, and are perhaps logically mutually exclusive. This is to say that practically every specific of traditional orthodoxy in Christendom is intellectually at war with the basic premises upon which the constitutional and legal structures of the Republic rest. That is far too pessimistic. In fact, the constitutional framework has done just what Jefferson and Madison said it would: fostered and protected religion. The extraordinary religiosity of America, unparalleled throughout the developed world, is part of the continuing legacy of that legal separation. Besides, the two are not absolute opposites. There are rational evangelicals and pious